He was a respected professor. He called me a forger and a fraud in front of the whole family. My attorney subpoenaed his university emails. They proved he knew I was his biological son since 1991. The court awarded me the full trust, plus damages. For 12 years, I was the family con artist, the faker, the guy who forged documents to steal an inheritance he didn't deserve. My own mother wouldn't look me in the eye. My uncle, a genealogy professor no less, told everyone I'd fabricated birth records to get my hands on a $250,000 trust. I lost my job, my family, and my name. Then I spit into a plastic tube, mailed it off, and 6 weeks later got results that burned his entire empire to the ground. Turns out the man who accused me of faking my bloodline had been hiding his own for 30 years. My name is Kyle Brewer. I grew up in a ranch-style house in the North Valley of Albuquerque. Nothing fancy, 3 bedrooms, Apache lawn, a swamp cooler that barely worked in July. My dad, Ray Brewer, drove long-haul trucks for a freight company out of Los Lunas. He was on the road more than he was home. My mom, Janet, worked reception at a dental office on 4th Street. I was an only child, quiet kid, kept to myself mostly. The person I was closest to was my grandmother, Eleanor Alt. She lived in a little adobe place in Corrales, maybe 20 minutes north. I'd ride my bike there on weekends when I was young, and later I'd drive my beat-up Civic. She made green chili stew that could make you cry, and she had this way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room who mattered. She used to squeeze my hand and say, "You're the one who got all the good genes, mijo." I never thought much about that phrase, not until later. Eleanor passed in 2010. I was 20, pancreatic cancer, fast and cruel. She was diagnosed in March and gone by September. Her will established a trust of $247,800, the proceeds from selling her Corrales property. The money was to be distributed to her biological grandchildren upon turning 22. I was the only grandchild on the alt side. My mom's brother Gerald had married late and never had kids. His first wife died young. He remarried briefly, but that didn't produce any children either. Then there was Richard, Professor Richard Alt, Gerald's half-brother from their father's first marriage. He taught at the University of New Mexico, genealogical research, Southwestern lineage databases, land-grant family histories. He had published papers. He sat on advisory boards. At every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, every 4th of July barbecue, he insisted everyone call him Uncle Rich. He'd show up with a bottle of wine that cost more than my mom's grocery bill and hold court at the head of the table like he'd built it himself. Richard had no biological children of his own, at least none the family knew about. What I didn't understand at 20 was that Richard had a vested interest in where that trust money went. If I was disqualified, the funds would revert to the broader alt estate, and Richard held advisory power over how that estate was dispersed. He wasn't just family. He was the gatekeeper. At 21, I was finishing trade school at Central New Mexico Community College and starting an HVAC apprenticeship at a small outfit in the South Valley. Good guys, $12 an hour to start, which felt like a fortune. On my 22nd birthday, I filed the paperwork to claim the trust. I submitted my birth certificate, my mother's birth certificate, and Eleanor's will through a probate attorney on Lomas Boulevard. Standard process, nothing complicated, or so I thought. Within 2 weeks, Richard Alt contacted the probate court and the family's estate lawyer. He claimed there were irregularities in my documentation. He said my birth certificate showed signs of alteration. He implied I may have been secretly adopted, which would mean I didn't qualify as a biological grandchild. He presented himself as an expert in document authentication, a professor, a man of credentials. The court took it seriously. I called my mom. She didn't pick up. I called again the next day. Voicemail. I drove to her house. She opened the door halfway and said she was tired and couldn't talk about it right now. She looked at the floor the entire time. I asked her one question. "Mom, am I adopted?" She said, "Kyle, please just leave it alone." Then she closed the door. I didn't get invited to Thanksgiving that year. I found out later there was a gathering at Gerald's house in Rio Rancho. The whole alt side was there. Richard stood up after dinner in front of 15 people, aunts and cousins and second cousins I'd known my whole life, and said the words that would follow me for the next 12 years. Kyle is not who he says he is. He forged those papers, and I can prove it. The probate court froze the trust pending investigation. Richard filed a formal challenge, 14 pages. He submitted an affidavit claiming that as a professional genealogist, he had, quote, identified documentary inconsistencies in my birth records. He pointed to a font variation on the birth certificate, a supposed mismatch in file numbers. He made a big deal out of the fact that my mom had briefly lived in El Paso around the time I was born, implying the birth may have been registered fraudulently across state lines. He presented all of it in that calm, academic tone of his, footnotes and everything, like he was peer-reviewing a journal article instead of destroying his nephew's life. The Albuquerque Journal ran a small item in the Metro section. Trust dispute, alleged document fraud. They didn't use my name, but it didn't matter. Albuquerque isn't that big. My apprenticeship supervisor at the South Valley shop saw it. Someone showed him. By Friday, I was let go. He sat me down in the back office and said he couldn't have someone, quote, under investigation for forgery, handling client paperwork and permits. He said he was sorry. He looked like he meant it. That didn't help. In less than a month, I went from having a career, an inheritance, and a family to having nothing. I drove to Richard's office at UNM on a Tuesday afternoon, the anthropology building, second floor. His name was on a brass plate next to the door. I stood in the doorway, and I didn't sit down. You know those documents are real, I said. You've seen my birth certificate at Grandma's house 100 times. He didn't look up from his desk. I've seen a lot of documents in my career, Kyle. Doesn't mean they're all authentic. Why are you doing this? That money was Grandma's wish. She wanted me to have it. Eleanor was a sentimental woman. Sentiment doesn't override legal standards. You're lying. You know I'm her grandson. Richard finally looked up. His voice was ice, flat and precise, and completely without warmth. I know what the evidence shows, and the evidence shows you're not who you think you are. I'd leave it alone if I were you. Or what? Or you'll find out things about your family you really don't want to know. I left that office shaking, not from anger, from those last words. Things about your family you don't want to know. It sounded less like a threat and more like a confession wrapped in a warning. But I was 22 and broke and suddenly radioactive. Nobody wanted to touch me. I couldn't afford a lawyer. The probate attorney my grandmother had originally hired dropped the case, citing conflict of interest. Richard had consulted for the same firm years earlier. Of course he had. He'd been threading himself into every institution in this city for decades. I tried to confront my mom. I drove to her house 3 times. The first time, she wouldn't open the door. I stood on the step and knocked for 10 minutes. The second time, Ray answered in his undershirt and said Janet wasn't feeling well. He looked at me like he didn't know what to say, and I realized maybe he didn't know anything either. The third time, my mom finally came outside. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed and her eyes red and said only this, "Just let it go, Kyle. Please, for all of us." She was crying. And in that moment, I realized something that confused me for years after. She wasn't angry at me. She was terrified. Not of me, not of the court, of something else entirely. I just didn't know what yet. I stopped calling. I stopped driving over. I let the trust sit frozen, and I let Richard's accusation float around Albuquerque like smoke I couldn't wave away. 6 months later, I got hired at Rio Grande Mechanical, HVAC service and install. That's where I met Danny Pacheco. Danny was 10 years older, grew up in Morelos, built like a fire hydrant, and had a philosophy about life that fit on a bumper sticker. If someone's trying that hard to keep you away from something, there's something there worth finding. He said that to me my second week on the job, after I told him the short version over lunch at Frontier Restaurant. He didn't flinch, didn't judge, just mopped up his green chili with a tortilla and said I should keep my eyes open. Danny let me crash at his place in the South Valley when I couldn't make rent that winter. He never asked for money. He became the brother I never had. For the next 11 years, I buried the whole thing. I didn't talk about the trust. I didn't talk about the accusation or my mother's silence. I worked. I got my journeyman license. I moved into my own place near Nob Hill. I dated a woman named Sophia Solis, and she didn't know any of it for the first 2 years. I built a life on top of the wreckage, and I told myself the foundation was solid enough. I would have kept it buried forever if Linda Solis hadn't handed me a Christmas gift that changed everything. Christmas 2025. I've been dating Maria Solis for 3 years by then. Her mom, Linda, was a retired nurse living off Coors Boulevard. She'd gotten into consumer genealogy as a hobby, Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, family trees pinned to a corkboard in her kitchen. She gave me a DNA kit as a stocking stuffer, half joking. Let's see if you're really as Irish as you claim, Kyle. I almost threw it in a drawer. Danny talked me into it over beers at Turtle Mountain the following week. What's the worst that happens? You find out you're boring? I spit into the tube, sealed it, mailed it off, forgot about it. 6 weeks later, the results arrived in my email on a Wednesday morning. I was sitting in my truck outside a job site in the Heights. The ethnicity breakdown was unremarkable, mostly Northern European, some Iberian, nothing surprising. But the relative matching feature flagged something that made my hands go cold on the steering wheel. A first-degree paternal match. Parent-child relationship. The account was registered under the initials RJA. I sat in that truck for 20 minutes. I didn't move. I didn't breathe right. RJA. Richard James Alt. The genealogy professor had used a DNA testing service himself, probably for research, and had never removed his profile. The algorithm doesn't lie. It doesn't have an agenda. It just reads base pairs and tells you who you belong to. I wasn't Ray Brewer's biological son. I was Richard Alt's. Conceived during an affair between Richard and my mother sometime in late 1990 or early 1991. I called Danny first. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I told you, if someone's trying that hard to keep you away from something." I called my mother second. She picked up on the first ring, like she'd been waiting 12 years for this exact call. When I told her about the DNA results, the line went silent. I counted the seconds, 40 of them. Then Janet Brewer said 5 words that rearranged my entire life. He told me this would never come out. She talked for 2 hours, the longest conversation we'd had since I was 20. She told me that when she got pregnant in early 1991, she panicked and told Richard. He paid for her to handle it quietly. But she kept the baby. She kept me. Richard was furious. He told her if she ever revealed the paternity, he'd destroy her marriage and her family's reputation. Ray Brewer never knew. Ray drove his trucks and came home tired and loved me like his own because he believed I was his own. When Eleanor died and left the trust to biological grandchildren, Richard saw a ticking time bomb. If I claimed the money, the legal process might require genetic verification. A simple test would expose everything. The forgery accusation was never about documents. It was about making me disappear from the process before anyone thought to order a DNA test. He'd sacrificed his own son's life to protect a 30-year-old secret. I hired an attorney the following Monday, Patricia Navarro, probate litigator out of a firm on 2nd Street downtown. Danny recommended her. His cousin had used her in an estate dispute and said she was relentless. He was right. Patricia's first move was filing a motion to reopen the trust case based on newly discovered evidence. Her second move was subpoenaing Richard Alt's archived university email from 1991 through 2014. She argued relevance to the fraud claim Richard himself had initiated. The court agreed. UNM complied. In the archive, Patricia found a 2012 email from Richard to a colleague in the genetics department. It read, Spoke to my attorney about the trust issue. He agrees. If we can get the kid disqualified on a document challenge, nobody ever needs to run a paternity test. Clean solution. There it was, in writing, in his own words from his own university account. Richard hadn't accused me of forgery because he believed it. He'd done it because he knew I was his son, and the forgery claim was the only way to keep that secret buried. Linda Solis did more than give me the kit. Once the results came back, she spent weeks helping me understand the platform, building out the family tree, documenting the match with Richard's profile. When Richard attempted to scrub his account 2 days after I confronted my mother, Linda had already downloaded and notarized screenshots of every match page. "I've been a nurse for 30 years, she told me over her kitchen table. "I know what it looks like when someone's hiding a diagnosis. That man's been hiding you your whole life." The court date was set for April. Richard had spent 12 years making everyone believe I was a fraud. Now I had his own DNA, his own emails, and his own words, proving he'd been the liar all along. But I still didn't know if my mother would show up, or whose side she'd be on. The hearing took place at the 2nd Judicial District Court in downtown Albuquerque on a Tuesday morning in April. Clear sky, 72 degrees. The kind of day that feels like it has no business hosting the worst moment of someone's life. Richard arrived with his attorney. He wore a navy blazer and a tie I recognized from family Christmases 15 years ago. He had the expression of a man who still believed his credentials would carry the room, like the letters after his name were a force field. Kyle Brewer sat at the other table with Patricia Navarro. Danny Pacheco was in the gallery, 3rd row back, arms crossed. Linda Solis sat next to him with a manila folder in her lap. My mother was not there. Patricia laid it out methodically. The DNA results first, then the relative match from the platform, backed by Linda's notarized screenshots taken before Richard scrubbed his profile. Then Janet's statement, given in a recorded deposition the week before. It was the first time my mother had told the full truth in over 30 years. Her voice on the recording was thin and flat and steady, like she'd rehearsed it 1,000 times in her head and was finally just reading it aloud. And then the emails. Richard's attorney tried. He argued the emails were taken out of context. He suggested the DNA match could be coincidental, that the platform's algorithms weren't forensic grade. He said the trust language was ambiguous, and that biological grandchild required a stricter legal definition. The judge listened. She let him finish. She wasn't having any of it. Patricia read the 2012 email aloud in open court. "Spoke to my attorney about the trust issue. He agrees. If we can get the kid disqualified on a document challenge, nobody ever needs to run a paternity test. Clean solution." She let it sit for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Richard. "Professor Alt, you are a genealogist. You study bloodlines for a living. You knew exactly whose blood ran through Kyle's veins, and you used your expertise not to reveal the truth, but to bury it." Richard said nothing. His attorney leaned over and whispered something. Richard shook his head once. The judge ruled that I was a biological descendant of the Alt family, that the original forgery accusation had been filed in bad faith, that the trust should be dispersed immediately with interest. Total award, $247,800 in principal, plus $89,200 in accrued interest and damages for the fraudulent challenge. Richard was referred to the state bar for potential sanctions and to UNM's Office of Research Integrity for review. As I walked out of the courthouse, I passed Richard on the steps. He looked 10 years older than he had walking in. The blazer hung wrong on his shoulders. He said quietly, almost to himself, "I was trying to protect the family." I stopped. "No, you were trying to protect yourself. I was the family you threw away." He didn't answer. I kept walking. Richard quietly retired from UNM within 6 months. The university launched an internal review of his research integrity. The results were never made public. Gerald Alt, who had stayed neutral through the entire original dispute, called me for the first time in years. He apologized. He said he'd always suspected Richard's motives, but didn't want to blow up the family. I told him the family was already blown up. He'd just been standing far enough away not to feel the heat. Ray Brewer, now 64 and living in Tucumcari, learned the truth. Danny drove me out there on a Saturday. We sat on Ray's porch and I told him everything. He was quiet for a long time. Then he called me and said simply, "You're still my kid. That doesn't change." It was the first time I'd cried in years. My mother asked to meet at a coffee shop on Central Avenue near Old Town. She brought a photo album, pictures of me as a baby, as a toddler at Eleanor's house in Corrales. She said she was sorry. She said she'd been 23 and terrified, and that Richard had convinced her silence was the only option. I listened. I didn't forgive her. Not yet. But I didn't leave. We sat for 2 hours. When she got up to go, she said, "Your grandmother knew. I think that's why she wrote the trust the way she did." I don't know if that's true, but I want it to be. I used part of the money for a down payment on a small house in Nob Hill, 3 blocks from the shop. Maria and I got engaged in the spring. Danny was the first person I told. Linda started planning the reception before I finished the sentence. I set aside a portion to fund a scholarship through CNM's trade program for students who had their careers disrupted by circumstances outside their control. I named it the Eleanor Alt Memorial Fund. I didn't name it after myself. I didn't need to. Richard spent his whole career studying where people come from, bloodlines, migration patterns, who belongs to whom. And the whole time, he had a son sitting 20 minutes across town that he refused to claim. He used genealogy as a weapon. But DNA doesn't care about your credentials or your cover stories. It just tells the truth. I spent 12 years being called a liar. Turns out, I was the only honest person in the room.